Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing a follow-up to my last build. At the end of my last video, I asked how I could possibly build a Belmont in Baldur's Gate 3, because obviously I've built the other Castlevania characters. I've made a build inspired by Alucard and by Cypher, but the problem is there's no whips in Baldur's Gate 3, so it's a bit hard to make the kind of iconic Belmont playstyle without a whip. However, it was obviously pointed out to me that there is a weapon that I was overlooking, the Sorrow. Sorrow comes with the unique ability to use a specialized version of the cantrip Thorn Whip as a bonus action once per turn, and it works a little bit differently than your normal cantrip. It scales differently, and obviously it's used as a bonus action, so obviously that created room for me to make a build based around that. So I took a look on the Castlevania wiki and got some idea for the kind of upgrades and items that the Belmonts would use in the games, and then in addition to that, also figured out a way to play a with this weapon in a way that felt like it made sense for like a monster/vampire hunter, especially one that existed in the world of Baldur's Gate 3, because in BG3 not only would they just be hunting vampires, and I guess in Castlevania as well, they'd also be hunting undead and like other things. So it kind of got me thinking about how I could use the kind of Polearm playstyle mixed in with the whip playstyle to create something that flows solidly and makes sense for the character. And to be honest, while the build I've come up with is fairly simple overall when you actually realize how it's executed, it's still very powerful, and when I kind of explain like my choices for things, it definitely feels like it falls in line with kind of what I was going for. So I hope you enjoy this one, as it was quite interesting to make, and I'm quite happy to complete the trio. But in the end, obviously, while this build, at least looks-wise, is inspired by Trevor Belmont, it's not really meant to be any specific Belmonts, just kind of inspired by them. So if I'm missing some specific abilities here or there, that's why. But anyways, without further ado, let's get into the build. The Belmonts are humans, quite famously, so I've gone with human today. This is going to give us the basic racial movement speed, as well as weapon proficiency with spears, pikes, halberds, and glaives, so no matter what your class, you can still use our weapon of choice, and you would also get armor proficiency with light armor and shields. We are going to be starting off as a fighter today, though, so you don't have to worry about that too much. You're also going to get an extra skill proficiency, which is nice. So, as I just said, we're starting with fighter, giving us access to second wind, all armor and weapons, as well as concentration saving throw proficiency, which doesn't really come up as much in this build, but we will have a use for it later on. Moving on, we get to choose our fighting style, and as you can see, we've got a few more options here. That's right, now available on all platforms, there is the Fighting Style Expanded mod, adding in all of the fighting styles from tabletop to the classes that can take them. This is really fun, and in my testing I did try out Tunnel Fighter. As a bonus action, you can enter a defensive stance that lasts until the start of your next turn, and while in your defensive stance you can make an opportunity attack without using your reaction, and you can use your reaction to make a melee attack against creatures that move more than 1.5 meters while within your reach. So basically, by spending one of your bonus actions, spoilers for the build, I guess, you can basically go into this completely defensive state where you can attack anyone who comes towards you or tries to leave your range. This is kind of powerful. If you have a cleric in the party that can use something like Turn Undead, this is going to work really well against those types of enemies, or if you have a way to make creatures kind of flee away from you. So if you are using maybe like somebody with frightening effects, if you decide maybe to go down that route with Alucard, or like I say, if you have a cleric in the party that can turn undead, making them run away, you're just going to get free attacks on a lot of them. So while this fighting style would have a little bit of overlap with a feat that we're going to be picking later, obviously Tunnel Fighter does still have a place in this build, so if you have the mod and you want to give it a try, I absolutely recommend it. Otherwise, you've got some other fun ones like Interception to kind of have a bit more defensive play. There's also blind fighting if you want to be immune to blindness, since vampires do tend to fight in the dark, or of course you can just go for the vanilla great weapon fighting, since we are using a two-handed weapon. You have a lot of options available to you now, but Tunnel Fighter definitely felt like a good fit for this build, for feeling like someone who just gets stuck in and does some damage. So I really like this fighting style for this build, so it's what I decided to go with, but feel free to play around with it. Moving on to our ability scores, we've got a pretty standard fighter spread here. Strength is is at 16 as it is going to be our main attacking modifier. Dexterity is at 10 because we don't really need it on this build, and we also kind of are using heavy armor. Obviously, Belmonts are typically pretty nimble, but unfortunately, in order to get this build to work the way I wanted it to, we had to sacrifice one of the kind of main stats, and dexterity was the one I had to give up. But don't worry though, we're making up for it with a piece of heavy armor that fits the build very, very well. Constitution is at 14. I would like this a bit higher, and feel free to drop one of the feats from this build to make this higher if you so desire. Otherwise, 14 will do just fine. We have more than enough defense. Intelligence is at 16. This is because we are going to need our spellcasting modifier in order to make Sorrowful Lash work efficiently. Sorrowful Lash on the Sorrow will use our intelligence modifier because that is the modifier that comes from Fighter, so we do need to use it. It will determine how much damage it does and its chance to hit. And we won't be leveling it up from 16 at all in this build, but we do have a way of making it more effective overall. If you find that starting off at 16 isn't actually necessary with the strategy that I've employed, you can swap con and intelligence if you want. Feel free to experiment with those stats and see where your best success range lies. Wisdom is at 10 because I didn't want it at 0, and Charisma is at 8. A lot of people would say that the Belmonts are quite charismatic people. Those who have watched the Castlevania anime would say Trevor is quite charismatic, but I don't think Trevor is charismatic in the right way. Like, he tries to be this suave badass, but ends up kind of just getting shut down a lot of the time. Like, it sounds like someone at a D&D table who plays like they are a high charisma character, but actually has really low charisma. I don't know. I feel like actually having a low charisma Belmont kind of makes sense in a way if you kind of go down that logic, but I digress. Moving on to skill proficiencies, of course I went with the soldier background. Belmonts are trained from a very young age to be vampire slayers, so soldier felt appropriate, giving us access to athletics and intimidation. I did choose Arcana for our human proficiency, because it kind of felt like that having knowledge of magic items makes sense for our vampire hunters, so I went with that here, but I could also see religion working, but we have a decent score in that anyway. So for our other skill proficiencies for fighter, I went for history and perception. Perception just makes sense to see the vampires coming, and history is, again, in order to beat your enemy, you have to know them. So having history did also make sense, but I can also see nature being justified for this as well. Overall, pretty happy with the skill selection. It feels rather flavorful, and of course we do get our one charisma skill in there, so there's a chance you could do something as if you're ever the leader in conversation, which maybe you should just leave that one to the others. Moving on to level 2 of fighter, we're going to get to choose action surge. I mean, what did I say choose? We just get action surge. You all know what this does. It's an extra action to use once per short rest. Very, very powerful. Moving on to fighter level 3, we get to choose our subclass, and if you have the 5e fighter subclass expanded mod available on all platforms, you have a lot of options to you here. I did actually consider using Rune Knight for this build, but the kind of growing into a giant didn't really fit the vibe, although as much as I liked kind of using the runes to like kind of replace the Castlevania magic items. So if you want to go down that route, you can. I also feel Cavalier works pretty well, giving you the like kind of defensive buffs that would give. Or even Brutes can actually work quite well if you just want to be a straight up get in there kind of slugger character, but in the end I went for Polearm Master, not only because it's going to give us a lot of versatility in how we're able to approach combat, but it's also going to give us some unique synergy with some of the things that Sorrowful Lash is actually going to do for us, which is the maneuvers. We're first off going to get a pretty interesting maneuver that I don't usually go straight for in my builds, but I do want to use here. That is Pushing Attack. Pushing Attack is going to allow us to damage an enemy and push them 4.5 meters away. With our increased range from our, long polearm weapon, we're actually going to be able to push our enemies back far enough that they have to run back into our range. And with Tunnel Fighter and eventually Polearm Master, which we're going to be getting very soon, that means that our enemies are always going to be taking attacks whenever they come close to us. So Pushing Attack is a little bit of interesting synergy. And if they happen to stop just outside our range, we could pull them in with Sorrowful Lash, because it's like Thorn Whip, it pulls the enemies in, then push them back out of our range. We're going to have a lot of forced movement on this build, which I think is very, very fun. We're also going to grab Sweeping Attack. Again, we have quite a long range weapon, so the likelihood of us being able to hit multiple targets is quite high. Unlike the other maneuvers, though, this one doesn't apply an additional damage boost, so it may not be as valuable to some others. So you can choose to take that whether you want to or not. I also like Goading Attack on this
this build. Goading attack makes it so that enemies have disadvantage on attack rolls to anyone against you, which is more than likely going to encourage them to come and attack us, meaning they move into attack range, meaning that they're going to get smacked immediately, and it also gives us the ability to kind of do a little bit of tanking for our allies by kind of bringing enemies in and then dodging their attacks. Otherwise, you do have access to other things which you could potentially get later. Trip attack is always good. Riposte could be very powerful. Menacing attack, if you want to possibly frighten targets, that can also work. You've got a lot of different options available to you that I do actually think all work really well for this build. Disarming Strike is another good one. In fact, I would probably recommend that over Sweeping Strike just because it has a lot of utility, but you can definitely pick up Sweeping Attack kind of later on if you want. But Disarming Attack is great, being able to knock the enemy's weapons out of their hands. This can be great because you can knock an enemy's weapon out of their hand with one attack, then push them away with another attack, meaning that they have to run back to you to pick it up, meaning that they smack them, meaning that you smack them, and they are way less of a threat. I don't know, pretty interesting combo overall. At fighter level 4, we're going to grab our first feat, and while this build does actually use 3 feats overall, one of them being Polearm Master, I am going to recommend that you take a bump to your strength first. This is just going to be a powerful baseline that's going to get you through the majority of the game. We already have Tunnel Fighter to cover some of Polearm Master's kind of abilities anyway, so I don't need to worry about getting those too early on into the build. So I definitely think just getting a straight stat bump is going to be nicer. There's going to be people out there in the comments who say, well, what's the point of buffing strength when you can just use the potions of whatever strength? And that's absolutely fine if you want to go down that route. In fact, I would recommend, if you're using this build, to maybe grab the Potion of Everlasting Vigor to push this up to 20 without another ability score improvement, and that would also give you more freedom if you want to put these stats somewhere else. Otherwise though, I say just for the most people who play this game casually, just bump up that strength. Moving on to fighter level 5, we get extra attack. You'll know what it does. Moving on to fighter level 6, we're going to be able to grab another feat. Now, it's entirely up to you what feats you tend to think are more important here to grab early on. Obviously, we can grab Polearm Master, which is going to do a similar thing to tunnel fighting, but it's also going to give us a bonus action attack and those opportunity attacks against targets who come close. That's not actually going to cost a bonus action to do. So it'll basically, it's like you kind of have to pick and choose how you want to adapt to things and different situations at a time. And yes, I do believe tunnel fighting and Polearm Master does stack, so you can, so basically it would allow you to make a reaction attack with your Polearm Master feature, and then obviously you don't spend your reaction to make regular opportunity attacks, so if people move away from you, you can attack them again. So it does kind of have a bit of synergy. It does clash a little bit, but I still think it's worth having, even just for the extra bonus action attack alone, because hey, damage is damage. But I can definitely see if you take tunnel fighting why you might not want this, as well as the fact that if you don't have the fighting style mod, you definitely want to take this. So overall, this is, I would say it's required but optional at the same time, if you catch my drift. But let's say we can pick up something else for now and just kind of say we're going to keep using Tunnel Fighter. Let's grab Sentinel. Whenever an enemy within melee range attacks an ally, you can use a reaction to make a weapon attack against that enemy. Of course, this is the typical Polearm Master Sentinel combo. Everyone knows how this goes. The target must not have the Sentinel feat as well. You gain advantage on opportunity attacks, which is great because we're going to be making a bunch of them, and whenever you hit a creature with an opportunity attack, it can no longer move for the rest of its turn, meaning it's not really going to go for your allies, meaning that if it's not using a long range weapon, it's not even going to be able to attack you when it comes in range, which can be very, very fun. Obviously, this is going to be a great feature for us, especially when we have the pushing attack as well. We're going to have a lot of, like, kind of just keeping enemies away from us, which is great. We're fighting zombies, we're fighting vampires, we're fighting creatures of the night. One of those suckers bites you, like, you're done. You're either a zombie or a vampire or something worse. So it absolutely makes sense that our playstyle is about locking down enemies. And when you think about it in the case of, like, if we were fighting with a whip weapon, then whips can bind, they can push people around, they can force enemies back. This all feels like it fits in line with a whip playstyle, while we do kind of get a whip. So we're almost like this new Belmont who fights with this weird, like, kind of long-range polearm that its handle can, like, kind of split apart, almost like Ivy's chain whip from Soul Calibur, if you guys know that series, and it, like, kind of becomes a whip by, like, kind of hitting, like, a trick weapon mode. Again, yeah, something like if you've ever played Bloodborne as well. Like the threaded cane comes to mind. I don't know, I just feel like it's an interesting way to kind of capture what would be like a lockdown, you know, prevent the enemies from getting close playstyle. It feels very, very fun, so I think Sentinel works perfectly here, but feel free to take either Polearm Master or Sentinel in either order. At level 7, we're going to get more superiority die and the ability to choose 2 more maneuvers. And again, you have some options available to you. Riposte could be a good one, like I say. We've got like things like menacing attack, maneuvering attack, commander strike if you really want to lead your allies. You've got so much available to you. In my testing, I took riposte and sweeping attack. I kind of just like those for their general utility, so we'll go with those for now. At fighter level 8, we do get to choose another feat, and I think here we will pick up Polearm Master. Now, at fighter level 9, we're not actually going to take it. This is where we multiclass. Now, this may seem like a bit of a late time to multiclass. I would say you can multiclass anytime after levels 5 or 6, but you definitely want to make sure you've got at least extra attack under your belt before you multiclass to Rogue. Rogue is going to give us access to sneak attack, and while we won't be able to use it on our melee weapon because it's not a finesse weapon, we will be using a ranged weapon with this build, so that does become available. We're also going to gain access to a skill proficiency and 2 skill expertise. Entirely up to you what you want to take here. I like the idea of grabbing maybe... I don't know actually. I could see stealth, sleight of hand, any of those being typically useful, though we are wearing heavy armor. Insight makes sense. I do like the idea of getting advantage on athletics, so we have a high jumping ability to kind of get that nimbleness that the Belmonts kind of have, as well as picking up maybe intimidation so that we do have a decent chance in conversation. And then for your other skill proficiency, I mean, you can kind of just pick whatever you want. I feel like investigation does make sense as well for a Belmont, as again, they would be ones to kind of sniff out and investigate vampires who are hiding amongst society, so I feel like that one can work. At Rogue level 2, you're going to get the ability to hide, dash, and disengage as a bonus action with Cunning Action. Now, these are actually extremely useful. We're going to be making use of dash in this build, as well as disengage, because, of course, if you can just disengage for free with one of your 2 bonus actions, yes, I mean, you all know where this is going, that means that enemies are still forced to move towards you, and you just get to attack them for free with your opportunity attacks. So, overall, makes a lot of sense to have this on the build, and again, I think the ability to be able to dodge and disengage out of enemy range is really important for a Belmont, because again, you don't want to get bitten. At Rogue level 3, we gain access to the Thief subclass because yes, we are taking Thief because it gives us our second bonus action. It's also going to give us resistance to falling damage, and Belmonts tend to fall off of things quite a lot. So I actually feel like this is very in character, but we're mainly here for that second bonus action. Now we have a wide array of things we can do with our bonus actions. We can Sorrowful Lash, we can disengage, we can dash, we can use both our Polearm Master weapon attack as well as a Sorrowful Lash in the same turn. It just gives us a lot of freedom that this build otherwise wouldn't have, so we can still constantly keep up our gimmick of using Sorrowful Lash to whip enemies around like a Belmont, while not sacrificing all of our utility. Now, if you feel like you're not doing much with that second bonus action overall, which trust me you will, you could instead just go for a full Baldur Master fighter build and get that third extra attack instead. But I still think this is worth it. You're not losing any feats, you're getting so much more, and it fits the playstyle perfectly that we're going for. So in my opinion, you want this one. And finally, at Rogue level 4, we do get our final feat of the build, and you have options. Ability score improvement, obviously an option here. Max out your strength. Bump up your intelligence for better Sorrowful Lash. Bump up your constitution for more health. It's entirely up to you. You could go with the Charger feat for another unique weapon attack that we can make use of with our double bonus actions, because these do take bonus actions. You can go for Crossbow Expert to use your crossbow at short range, because yes, this build does have a crossbow involved. There's so many different things you could do. Mobile for more movement speed. Lucky. Alert, so you're less likely to be surprised, and that kind of makes up for our lower dexterity. You've got so many options available to you. There is so much that you can do. But of course we want as much damage as possible, so we're going with Great Weapon Master. It just makes sense. It's a lovely capstone for the build. You're not going to feel overpowered early on for taking it right at the start. It's going to feel like for hitting the final level of this build, you're getting a massive boost in power. And of course, it works so well with this build as well because we have a double bonus action. If we do happen to get a kill or a crit, we can still make that extra full attack with one of our bonus actions and still be able to Sorrowful Lash. Yes, it comes with that -5 attack roll penalty, but there's plenty of items items that can offset that, including just one that we need for this build. So overall, you've got a pretty damn good selection here of feats, but again, because we have so many feats available to us, 4 in total, this build is very customizable. And like I say, you can kind of choose whatever of the fighter subclasses you want. I just do recommend these 4 levels of Thief Rogue, no matter which road you go down, but otherwise, I'm quite happy with this skill set overall. And that is the build. Overall, what you're going to be getting out of this is a lot of battlefield control and a high-powered martial character. You're going to be able to lock down enemy movement, be able to force them where you want them on the battlefield, and protect your allies by doing so. And when you need to, you can get out safely. You're able to whip enemies around with Sorrowful Lash, which again, I'll get more into in a minute, as well as having all of these extra options available to you at both melee and range. And as well, at the end of the day, you're a pretty powerful fighter. You've got nearly 100 HP, which again, if you've got a cleric in the party, which obviously I highly recommend for this build, go check out my elementalist, which was mostly sorcerer, but it had some cleric stuff in it. You can go for, like, you know, getting aid and such like that. Basically, as much as this build does do okay on its own, it works best with Alucard and Cypher. You absolutely want to have your cleric, your highly dexterous, you know, warlock character. You maybe even throw in, like, I don't know, maybe a wizard or something on this build, like some other character, like, or a druid. Like, you just got so many cool ways that you can kind of make a fun Castlevania themed team comp, and I love this build being at the helm of it. But let's talk about equipment, because obviously this is a very important part of this build. First up, our main weapon, the Sorrow Glaive. Obtainable right away in Act 1, you get this as a reward for rescuing Halcyon, which is awesome. This is a +1 weapon at its base, but we'll talk about the buff in a minute. That comes with Sorrowful Lash. Sorrowful Lash is a transmutation cantrip that deals 1d4 damage at a base, but scales with your class's spellcasting modifier. Normally, cantrips don't really do this on their own. You'd usually need something like the Potent Robe or Eldritch Blast's, you know, like Agonizing Blast feature from Warlock, but Sorrowful Lash just gets this anyway, so in the case of us being a fighter rogue, this scales with our intelligence, which is why we need it to be at least somewhat high to deal some damage. Now obviously it's not the most damage, it's 1d4 plus 3, but the most it can do is 7, and obviously if I wanted to make a pure Sorrowful Lash build, there is ways this could be optimized way better. Warlock, Potent Robe, all that sort of thing. So overall, it's not that great just on its own for dealing damage. What it's here for is the battlefield control that it provides, the fact that it's basically a free extra attack that we get to make every turn. I mean, technically, this is basically Polearm Master's, like, second half of the feat, without actually needing to take Polearm Master. I mean, like I say, we've got Polearm Master here, but we kind of also don't really need it, like I say, so again, feel free to play around with that slot. But honestly, this is mainly here for the theming. It is a great addition to the kind of overall playstyle of the build, as well as the theme of playing a Belmont, so I'm happy to have it here. Now, the reason this is a +2 weapon, with 1d4 thunder damage, long-time viewers of the channel will know this, is because I did decide to buff it with the Drakethroat Glaive. Because it's a +1 weapon at its base, it's not the greatest going into the late game, but the Drakethroat Glaive buff helps with that, allowing us to equip it with a Draconic Elemental weapon, giving it an extra +1 to make it a +2 total, and an extra d4 damage of an element of our choice. I went with Thunder, but looking back on it, Fire does make more sense for hunting vampires, as usually they're weak to fire in some shape or form, so having a fire enchantment on your weapon as a Belmont does make sense. But moving on to our ranged weapon of choice, we have Gandrel's Aspiration. You have advantage against monstrosity type enemies, so you always attack with advantage against things like that. Unfortunately, vampires are considered undead, so those don't count. However, we are going to get Sacred Munitions. As a bonus action, once per short rest, you can make it so all of your ranged weapon attacks possibly can inflict turn undead. There's a saving throw required. But again, that's another way to make your undead enemies move away from you, so it felt like it made sense to throw this on a Belmont. However, I will point out a potential endgame option. This is the long arm of the Gur, but because of the mod I used to add weapons, it's called the Undead Slayer Crossbow. It's an early access name. But the long arm of the Gur, when used against undead creatures, this weapon has a +1 bonus to attack and damage rolls. Great. Awesome. That feature's bugged and doesn't work. If this gets fixed in patch 8, I would actually recommend using this, or Gandrel's Aspiration. I mean, it's up to you, but I do think this works a little bit better for fighting vampires since it gets that extra damage buff, but unfortunately, as I said,
it is completely bugged and does nothing at the moment. So I would recommend waiting to see if this one gets fixed. I'll have a look at those patch 8 notes when I get the chance, when the patch officially comes out. So hopefully this gets sorted. Otherwise, just use Gandral's Inspiration. I think it does what we kind of want it to as a build anyway. Moving on to the helm, we have the Helmet of Arcane Acuity. Whenever you deal damage with a weapon attack, you gain Arcane Acuity for 2 turns. Arcane Acuity is going to add a +1 bonus to its spell attack rolls and spell difficulty class for each remaining turn. So basically what this does is, if we attack a couple of times with our main weapon attack, our Sorrowful Lash has a way higher chance to hit. So this is really going to be helpful in the kind of mid to end game and you'd get this weapon, this helm I should say, around the mid game as well, kind of like in early Act 2. So basically you just attack a couple of times and all of a sudden you're going to have a +4 to your attack rolls with Sorrowful Lash, basically guaranteeing that that's always going to go off. This is here as a great utility option for the build, so I'm quite happy to have it. No specific cloak on this build, but of course any of the usual ones work, cloak of protection, yada yada yada. Moving on, basically you can have any heavy armor in the game, especially as you get into the late game, but I wanted to point out the protective plate, it's called in the full game. Again, a lot of early access names today, I apologize, I really should change my mod list for a better item adding mod, but regardless, this comes with a base 18 armor class, which is not the worst, but also not the best, especially when you get into endgame, but this does feel like it makes the most sense for a vampire hunter, as it grants resistance to necrotic damage, no ifs, ands, or buts. So all of the usual necrotic stuff that vampires do, you resist, which I think actually makes a lot of sense for this build. So flavor and lore-wise, this is the perfect armor. Mechanically, in the end game you could probably do a bit better, so any heavy armor that strikes your fancy, slap it on, but I do like this one for what we're going for here. If we want to be a vampire hunter, we want to make sure we're doing it right. Moving on to our gloves, we have the Gauntlets of the War Master. Targets have disadvantage on saving throws against your maneuver, which is our Battle Master things, and weapon actions. So basically this is going to make it so our enemies have a much lower chance at succeeding things like being able to hold on to their weapon, or having the goaded condition, or being pushed away. They're much less likely to succeed against these things, and this gives us a +1 bonus to attack rolls, which is going to help offset the penalty from Great Weapon Master. Overall, I think these are pretty essential once you get into the late game, as enemies are going to have very high saving throws, so I feel like you're definitely going to want to pick this one up. But in the earlier game, you do have some other options. First up, this one's a bit of a niche pick, but absolutely could have its place in the build, the Cinder Snap Gloves. We have a lot of ways of locking down melee attacks, but ranged enemies could still be an issue, so protection from missiles is really going to help with that. It allows you to cast a concentration-based spell once per short rest called Cinder Snap Reflexes. That's what the actual condition is called, but the spell is called Protection from Missiles. It amplifies your reflexes to better contend with incoming missiles. Ranged weapon attacks against you have disadvantage and their damage is halved. This means that while we can prevent melee attacks, we can also severely reduce the damage that we're going to take from ranged attacks as well. So overall, as an early game option, I think this works quite well. But if you just want something that's more about damage, grab the Flawed Helldust Gloves to allow your weapon attacks to deal an additional 1d4 fire damage. Again, just that kind of anti-vampire buff. Also kind of anti-zombie buff, because you definitely want to burn those corpses to make sure they don't get back up again. Yeah, there's kind of a small fire theme to this build. In fact, no wonder Alucard was a freaking fiend warlock. He wants to burn Daddy alive. Damn. Anyways, moving on to the boots, which is going to be kind of an interesting pick. Now, of course, if you want to just max out your melee damage, you could go for the Boots of Wrath to dash as a bonus action and get up to a +7 to damage. However, the Boots of Arcane Bolstering feel a bit more in line with this build. It allows us to, every time we dash, we gain Arcane Charge for 2 turns, which means that while threatened, the affected entity has a -2 bonus to attack damage with spells. Now, the tooltip for this can be a little bit misleading. You yourself do not have to be threatened. The enemy has to be threatened. So basically, by dashing as a bonus action as a rogue using one of our 2 bonus actions, we now have a +2 damage to our Sorrowful Lash, making it a +5 overall, which is not a huge buff, but it definitely felt like it was in line with the build, and I get to show off a pair of boots that I don't ever really get to. So yeah, dash as a bonus action, and Sorrowful Lash is going to deal a bit more for you. But again, Boots of Wrath, what are they called? The Linebreaker boots, if you want that Wrath buff instead.
Moving on to our amulets, we have the Amulet of the Harpers. Yeah, this is kind of a free slot. I didn't really know what to put here, but the Amulet of the Harpers did make sense the more I thought about it. It gives us a once per long rest usage of shield, which can, I mean, one usage of shield is better than none, but it also gives us advantage on wisdom saving throw checks, which can be pretty nice, especially with our middling wisdom. Moving on to our rings, we have the Ring of Arcane Synergy. Whenever you deal damage with a cantrip, you gain Arcane Synergy for 2 turns. So, Sorrowful Lash is a cantrip, meaning that just by using our bonus action, we get to use Arcane Synergy to increase our weapon damage by our spellcasting ability modifier. For us, that's only going to be a +3, but hey, a +3 plus the Great Weapon Master buff, that's a +13 overall. That's really goddamn good. And finally, the Risky Ring. Now, again, as the name implies, this one's a hell of a risk. You gain advantage on all attack rolls, which means Great Weapon Master attacks are basically always guaranteed to hit, but you receive disadvantage on saving throws. Now, any advantage you get on saving throws cancels out the disadvantage, so our wisdom saving throws are still neutral. However, we are going to be basically always failing dexterity saving throws, which can be a bit tricky against things like grease or maybe something like ensnaring strength like you normally see in my combat footage, but I don't find it to be as big of a deal as most might believe. The biggest thing would be if you wanted to use this with maybe the Cinder Snap gloves, where obviously we'd have disadvantage on con saves, meaning that we're more likely to drop that concentration on Cinder Snap reflexes than anything else. So this one is a bit of a double-edged sword. You could move around some equipment pieces here and there if you want to focus more on offsetting the penalty without using this. There's obviously things like the Mask of Soul Perception, which give you a +2. With this, that's a +3, and then maybe you could do something else like maybe trying to think of what else. Maybe you could swap this out, maybe for the Legacy of the Masters, which I think gives you a +2, so that's a +4 overall. I mean, there's some math to be done here. This build obviously can be optimized like all of my builds, so feel free to mess around with the numbers on this one, but I found that in my testing, the Risky Ring is overall pretty safe, ironically enough. Usually the saving throws that you're going to want to be worrying about with this would be like Wisdom and Intelligence ones, but usually you're okay on them, so but be careful, just be careful. Right, finally the fashion stuff. Moving on to the camp clothing, we've got the Padded Armour version 3, which is basically just here for fashion to kind of give us that Belmont-ish look, alongside the leather boots too, which are both come from the Fear Tailor's camp clothing mod, available on all platforms. We've also got access to the Fan Morel dye from Faerunian Colours, again available on all platforms, which kind of gives us this brownish white look, somewhat reminiscent of Trevor Belmont from the games. But yeah, that is the build, and overall, I'd say this one is pretty good. As I said though, it does work at its best when paired with a cleric. I think this plus a proper cleric to keep this build healed up, if it does end up taking some hits, as well as being able to deal with the undead as well that this build primarily goes up against. I feel like, again, this build works as best as part of a team. You're protecting your allies, you're locking down your enemy's movement, and you're creating space for your allies to work in. I think that's an important part of this build, and again, I feel like the kind of lockdown, you're not going to touch me playstyle kind of makes sense for characters that use like a long-ranged like kind of whip. Again, whips are built to keep things away from you and attack at long range, which is kind of what the Castlevania characters do in the games. The whip is a long-range weapon and they get to poke from far away to minimize the chance of them taking damage. And we also have ways of protecting against projectiles as well. And I like the idea that this comes in the form of a long polearm weapon that has a whip. It feels like it just all kind of works out thematically and mechanically when all is said and done. Some of you may not agree. Some of you may have thought I should have played a druid or a nature cleric that just went all in on making Thorn Whip as powerful as possible. Hell, maybe even a warlock. And to be honest, that is a build to do at some point down the road. I definitely think a Pact of the Tome, because they get Thorn Whip from that, a warlock with the potent robe and all those shenanigans would work very, very well. There's also, you know, the Ballist armor, which can give vulnerability to piercing damage, which would obviously double the damage of Thorn Whip. You get the point. There's ways to optimize Thorn Whip and Sorrowful Lash itself, but in reality, I think for what we're trying to go for here, this works a little bit better. So overall, I'm quite happy with this one. Quite happy to, you know, kind of say this is what I would do for a Belmont build in this game. So yeah, I'm happy to leave it there. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.